When 700 elite soldiers arrived in Burkina Faso, the world realized who truly holds power now. No one expected the Pentagon briefing at dawn, not even the press knew until the engines roared. By the time the sun broke over Ouagadougou's dusty horizon, American boots were already in Burkinabe soil, 700 of them. Uniformed, armored, and silent, they moved like ghosts off the C-17 Globemasters. The people watched from their rooftops, confused. The military watched from the barracks, cautious. And IBRAHIM Traoré, Burkina Faso's defiant leader, watched. From behind bulletproof glass, calm but unblinking. Because he knew this wasn't a visit. This was a warning wearing the mask of protection. It all began days earlier. A failed drone strike. Not by terrorists, not by rebels, but by a nation that once called itself an ally. The missile had targeted the convoy of President Traore as he returned from a visit to the Sahel region. It missed, but barely. Debris tore through the escort vehicle behind his, killing 2 bodyguards. The message was clear. Someone wanted him gone. Someone powerful. And it wasn't the ragged warlords on motorcycles or rogue militias haunting the northern borders. It was someone with satellites and signatures. Within hours, Washington claimed responsibility. Accidentally, of course. A mistaken strike. But insiders whispered otherwise. The operation had been greenlit days before. An assassination cloaked in intelligence. Traoré's rising popularity across Africa, his bold rejection of Western influence, and his secret talks with Russia had shaken more than just old alliances. He was becoming the voice of a continent that had been spoken for too long. And some weren't ready for an Africa that spoke back. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't call for war. He didn't send diplomats begging for explanations. He did, something that terrified everyone more. He went silent. For 48 hours, not a single statement, no social media post, no address, just silence. And that silence grew heavier than any declaration. Because in that silence, the world imagined retaliation. Retaliation that would not come with missiles but with something more dangerous. Unity. Inside Washington, nerves shattered behind closed doors. Traoré had just returned from a regional summit in Bamako where whispers of a Pan-African defense pact had emerged. Something outside the grasp of NATO, China, or Russia. Something new, something dangerous, for those who had long kept the continent divided. And so, they flipped the script. Protection. That was the new message. "We will ensure his safety," said the spokesperson. "We stand with democracy." But no one mentioned that no one had asked them to. Burkinabe citizens stood still as armored vehicles rolled through the capital. The soldiers weren't smiling. They weren't waving. They were here on a mission no one quite understood. A mission cloaked in support, but carrying the sharp scent of occupation. Social media exploded. Some praised it as a shield against further attacks. Others called it a soft invasion. But one thing was certain. Traoré never asked for this. From the top floor of the presidential palace, he observed the convoys through a long-range lens. His aides murmured behind him, some anxious, some furious. But Traoré remained unmoved. His mind wasn't on the soldiers. It was on what came next. He had just signed a secret memorandum with 2 neighboring leaders, one from Mali, one from Guinea. They had agreed to pool security intelligence, share resources, and more importantly, cut off external surveillance routes controlled by foreign entities. The new Africa would patrol its own skies. What few knew was that in a deep vault beneath the palace, encrypted drives were being duplicated and loaded into secure capsules. Evidence, leaks, recordings, copies of classified cables that could expose the real reasons behind the Western unrest. Traoré wasn't planning war. He was planning exposure, and that was more dangerous. At an emergency meeting inside a U.S. Embassy safe house in Dakar, military advisors argued among themselves. Some demanded a public meeting with Traoré. Others warned that even a handshake now would look like submission. But behind all the debate, a name kept surfacing, Project Serpent, a black file operation that even most State Department officials hadn't heard of. Rumors said it was meant to neutralize any African leader threatening the global status quo, and Traore, with his charisma, youth, and military discipline, had just become its prime target. But Project Serpent had failed, and now America had 700 troops on the ground. To protect him. From whom? That was the question echoing across newsrooms and cafes. But in truth, Traore didn't need protection. He needed clarity. He needed time. And with these boots on his soil, he now had both. Because even the most aggressive nation won't risk a second public mistake. Not when the world is watching. Not when your enemy wears your own flag. That night, as the Commandos set up temporary camps around the capital, something strange happened. A power outage. Entire blocks of Ouagadougou went dark. But not the palace. There, inside the Situation Room, Traore stood before a wall of screens. Footage played in silence, night vision clips, intercepted calls, drone captures. He pointed toward one screen, zoomed in on a U.S. major speaking in hushed tones to a Burkina Faso general. He turned to his closest advisor and said only this: "We don't fight shadows. We bring them into the light." Outside, the darkness stretched over the city like a curtain, but behind it, moves were already being made. Files uploaded, backups dispersed, alliances solidified. America had landed soldiers, but Traore had just declared a different kind of war, a war of truths. The Americans set up their perimeter with clinical precision, sandbagged checkpoints, aerial drones, armored patrols at every strategic junction of Ouagadougou. Officially, they were there to protect Traore. Unofficially, they were waiting for orders, for signs, for reasons to intervene. But what unnerved them most was the silence. There were no threats, no angry crowds, no protests or resistance, just silence. A nation watching with unblinking eyes, refusing to react. And behind that silence stood a man who had mastered the art of waiting. Traore knew the American playbook: disrupt, install, protect. But he also knew the one weakness they never accounted for: unity built on shared betrayal. Because while global powers moved chess pieces across Africa for decades, they underestimated how much Africans were learning, remembering, preparing. This time, the continent wasn't just reacting, it was coordinating. 3 nights after the landing, a confidential signal was sent from the palace to encrypted devices in Guinea, Mali, and Niger. The message was simple. Phase 2 begins at dawn. There was no further instruction. Those who received it understood. While soldiers drank bottled water in foreign uniforms, the true defense was awakening in plain clothes. In the north, local militias loyal to Traore began pulling back, not in fear, but in formation. The streets cleared not because people were scared, but because they were planning. What looked like surrender was camouflage. And beneath that stillness, data flowed, from civilians to independent journalists to regional commanders. The Americans weren't guarding Traore. They were being watched by Traore's people. Across the Atlantic, things were unraveling. Leaked documents began to surface. Leaks that were surgical, precise. Not flashy enough to cause hysteria, but sharp enough to cause discomfort. Meeting notes, intercepted emails, redacted names with just enough context to spark suspicion. French journalists whispered about a joint strike initiative, an old colonial whisper of regime change under the guise of peacekeeping. And every whisper led back to one man, Traore. But still, he spoke nothing of it. No press conferences, no public outrage. He walked through his daily routine unshaken, receiving ambassadors, inspecting agricultural projects, smiling with school children. And the silence became suffocating for those who expected chaos. Because silence in politics, when used correctly, is a sword sharper than words. Then came the moment that shifted the game entirely. At a regional summit in Cotonou, West African heads of state gathered under the illusion of discussing border security. But in the final hour, the doors were sealed, phones removed. Only 12 men remained in that marble-floored hall. And it was there that Traore laid the blueprint for Sovereign Sky, an initiative to create Africa's first independent satellite intelligence network, owned and operated entirely by a coalition of African states. No foreign partners, no borrowed tech. Just African engineers, African skies, and African data. It wasn't just a technological shift. It was a declaration of independence in an era ruled by information, and it was terrifying to those who relied on surveillance to predict and control. 2 days later, U.S. military analysts detected unusual signal activity from a previously inactive station near Bobo Dioulasso. A satellite pinged to life, scrambled data bouncing across West African nodes. Their first thought was Russian interference. But it wasn't. It was homegrown, built in silence, launched without warning. A proof of concept that Africa no longer needed eyes from the sky. It had grown its own. Inside the U.S. Embassy, the mood grew darker. Orders from Washington shifted from observe to engage diplomatically. Meetings were requested. Traore declined every one. His secretary delivered the same message again and again. He is focused on national matters. Please send a written proposal. But no proposal came, because they didn't have one. Not yet. Meanwhile, in the slums of Ouagadougou, something curious was happening. Community centers suddenly had internet access. Children were seen gathering in corners with tablets. Teachers arrived wearing no official badges but carried bags filled with books, devices, and pamphlets marked with a strange logo. A lion encircled by stars. It was the mark of Project Wakilima, a civilian awakening program seeded by Pan-African intellectuals. Funded not by governments but by diasporas. It wasn't militarized. It was mental, and it was spreading. The Commandos still stood guard, but they were guarding a shell. The real heartbeat of the country had shifted underground, into mines, into systems, into signals. Then came the broadcast. Without warning, Traore appeared on every screen across West Africa. Not through a press conference, but through a documentary, pre-recorded, timed perfectly. It opened with footage of colonial-era agreements, black and white images of exploitation, betrayal, forced silence. Then it moved into the present, maps, showing military bases, mineral contracts, and surveillance lines. And finally, it revealed faces. Faces of agents, diplomats, and foreign CEOs who had tried to orchestrate destabilization across the Sahel. He didn't speak until the final minute. "Will not raise a weapon against a neighbor," he said, eyes fixed on the lens. "But I will not kneel to those who call themselves friends while sharpening knives behind their backs." That single sentence sparked what no army ever could. Universities in Senegal, Ghana, and Cameroon held solidarity rallies. Influencers from Congo to Kenya posted side-by-side images of Traore and anti-colonial heroes of the past. And across the diaspora, from Paris to Atlanta to Johannesburg, voices rose. For the first time in decades, Africa wasn't asking for a seat at the table. It was building its own. And the Commandos? They were still there, still patrolling, still watching. But now, it was they who felt the eyes. And Traore? He smiled. Not because he won, but because he never played the game they expected. 3 weeks had passed since the boots touched Burkina Faso soil, yet none of them had moved beyond their designated zones. The American presence, once ominous, had become hollow. They were no longer soldiers with power. They were symbols of a power that no longer worked. Traore hadn't resisted them. He hadn't welcomed them either. He had made them irrelevant, and in geopolitics, irrelevance is a death sentence. The old order had relied on reactions, panic, protests, violence. But Traore's response was colder, more effective. He offered them space, time, silence, and through that silence, he exposed them. Because soldiers are not frightening when their presence no longer carries meaning. And meaning was exactly what Traore had reclaimed. By now the West had begun to understand. This wasn't about Traore alone. It was about the fabric of influence, unraveling. From Kinshasa to Khartoum, whispers had become declarations. No longer requests for aid, but demands for respect. And what terrified foreign ministries most wasn't the threat of war. It was the threat of an idea that Africa could lead itself, fund itself, defend itself, and most dangerously, define itself. The CIA dispatched an unofficial envoy, a black American intelligence officer fluent in Hausa, familiar with the region, and supposedly sympathetic. His objective was simple: infiltrate, find weaknesses, offer deals. Whisper enough, promises to seduce a fracture. But what he found instead was iron. He met with youth leaders posing as non-governmental volunteers. He spoke to economists who quoted Sankara, not Smith, and in every meeting he was met not with suspicion, but indifference. They had no interest in deals. Because they weren't trying to win Western approval anymore. They were trying to survive. And then came the blow Washington hadn't prepared for. Traore's meeting with China was cancelled. The West had feared he would pivot toward Beijing. But Traore had no interest in trading one leash for another. "We do not change masters," said his advisor in a leaked voice memo. "We remove the idea of masters altogether." That refusal rippled across intelligence reports like a tremor. Analysts were stunned. This wasn't the Cold War playbook. Traore wasn't East or West. He was sovereign, and that made him unpredictable. Meanwhile, the 700 commandos sat idle. Their presence had become a media embarrassment. Questions flooded. Capitol Hill. Why are our troops in a country that hasn't requested them? What are we guarding? What happens if they ask us to leave? Inside the palace, Traore drafted a letter, short, precise, and firm. It was delivered to the U.S. ambassador at dawn. Burkina Faso thanks all international forces for their concern regarding national security. We now request full withdrawal of all non-invited military personnel within 10 days, in accordance with Article 3 of our territorial sovereignty doctrine. Any further presence will be considered an act of foreign aggression. There were no threats, just clarity. It was law, not war. But law, when used by the right man at the right time, can dismantle an empire. The Pentagon scrambled. They sent a new team, this time diplomatic, this time careful. But Traore refused all sit-downs, not out of spite, but out of strategy. He had no need for compromise when the narrative had already shifted. The world now saw the occupation for what it was: not protection, but surveillance. Not alliance, but hesitation. The final straw came when a young Burkina journalist published a series of exposés detailing how specific American NGOs had been conduits for regional data siphoning. She had obtained evidence, video recordings, internal notes. It was surgical, and the world read every word. In Washington, hearings erupted. In France, protests began. And in Africa, unity solidified. The U.S. began withdrawal quietly. No press coverage, no apologies. One by one, the transport planes arrived. The commandos boarded, gear packed, questions unanswered. And as they flew, into the horizon, a new dawn rose, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation watching. At the airport, no one waved them goodbye. Not out of anger, but because they were already looking forward. Traore walked through a school construction site that afternoon. His hands were dusty, his boots worn. Children followed him, asking questions about history, not war. He stopped by a mural, a painting of Africa, with its countries shaped like gears of a machine. He touched the paint, still fresh, and said to no one in particular, "The empire never left. We just stopped feeding it." 10 days after the last American soldier stepped off Burkina soil, something extraordinary happened. Nothing. No retaliation, no sanctions, no public condemnations from Washington. Just silence. And that silence screamed louder than any airstrike. Because the old guard had lost its grip, and they knew it. Burkina Faso, under Traore, had not just expelled 700 U.S. commandos. It had expelled a century-old blueprint, one built on dependency, fear, and selective sovereignty. But this victory was not one man's alone. In Dakar, university students staged a symbolic tribunal against foreign intervention, complete with testimonies, timelines, and mock verdicts. In Lagos, musicians released protest anthems with lyrics in Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, calling not for violence, but for vision. In Kigali, engineers proposed the Digital Border Project, aimed at blocking foreign surveillance from unregistered platforms. The energy had shifted from resistance to renaissance. What Traore ignited was not a revolution of guns, but of consciousness. And yet, beneath that celebration, he remained cautious. Because empires do not fall overnight, they adapt. They retreat in silence only to re-emerge in softer forms, investment offers, cultural exchanges, corporate partnerships. Traore understood that colonialism had changed clothes, not character. So he did not gloat. He planned. He convened a secret summit deep in the Wahiguya forest. No cameras, no press. Only trusted minds, Pan-African thinkers, rogue economists, ex-diplomats, and historians. There, under the thick Sahel canopy, he introduced the framework for the Horizon Pact, a 5-decade development plan independent of Western institutions. It included everything: food sovereignty, energy independence, Pan-African currency, judicial council, cultural reclamation. No speeches, just strategy. Meanwhile, in Washington, the damage was deeper than headlines. For the first time since the Cold War, there was open dissent within U.S. intelligence communities about Africa policy. Junior analysts leaked memos. Retired officials gave unfiltered interviews. Even think tanks, long held in polite silence, began publishing scathing critiques. They questioned everything: the legitimacy of interventionism, the ethics of aid, with strings, the morality of proxy politics. But none of that mattered to Traore. His focus was Burkina Faso, and not the map version, the living one. The farmer who finally owned his land title. The girl in Bobo Dioulasso who received a scholarship without begging a foreign NGO. The water project in Koudougou run entirely on solar grids designed by Burkinabe engineers. The new national curriculum that included indigenous knowledge, African philosophy, and anti-colonial history. The country wasn't just healing, it was reimagining itself. And yet, the shadows lingered. One evening, an advisor handed Traore a manila envelope. Inside were recent surveillance shots, taken from a drone not registered in any known airspace control logs. The source was anonymous. The angle was familiar. Overhead, from high. Watching him walk to his private residence. Watching his mother's compound. Watching his life. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then he handed it back. "Let them watch," he said, "as long as they no longer command." That night, a new law passed in secret. All unregistered foreign satellites over Burkina Faso would be digitally jammed, then named publicly, with coordinates, times, and nations of origin. Not an act of war, an act of clarity. Weeks passed. Then came the invitation. The United Nations, shaken by recent criticism, extended a formal request to President Traore to address the General Assembly. The world wanted to hear from him, understand him, measure him. He declined. Instead, he uploaded a speech from the heart of Ouagadougou, beneath a mango tree where Sankara once addressed villagers. There were no lights, no podiums, just dust, sun, and resolve. "I am not here to be understood by those who never listened," he said, eyes unwavering. "I am here to be remembered by those who always knew." That line reverberated across continents. Burkina Faso's currency stabilized. Foreign investors, African ones, stepped in. And in place of old aid contracts came trade agreements, forged on equity. No one offered charity. They offered partnership. And across Africa, a phrase began to rise. Traore time, not as worship, but as a symbol of awakening. In a small, coastal village in Liberia, a teenage girl painted a mural of him, not in military uniform, but as a farmer, watering a tree. In Soweto, an elder named her grandson, Ibrahim. In Morocco, a cafe renamed its largest table, La Table du Lion. And, in the West, they watched, and this time, they understood. Because for the first time, they weren't watching an African crisis. They were witnessing an African choice. And Traore? He stood still. Because stillness, in a world trained to chase chaos, is the ultimate power.